Good morning, everybody. Good morning. We're going to do that rare thing of actually starting on time. Surprise. Warm welcome to day 2 of the Oxford Generative AI Summit. Yesterday was so much sunnier, wasn't it? But all the more reason to be inside. My name's Charlie Beckett. I'm from the London School of Economics, and I'm really delighted to be with such a superbly curated panel, actually, with diverse perspectives on generative AI and journalism. Very quickly, on the far left there is Rana, who's a professor at City University, teaches digital journalism. I'm always surprised we still call it digital journalism. What journalism is not digital these days? Next to me is Rusbridger, who has what the Americans call a storied career in journalism. He's lived and worked through technological changes and all sorts of other changes in journalism over the last few decades. Still on the Meta panels, right? You still, the Oversight board. So has both a sort of journalistic perspective, but also perhaps a broader perspective on the kind of infrastructure and ethics, indeed, around this technology. To my right, Peter from the Financial Times. He's actually a real journalist who actually does real journalism using some of these tools. And Melissa from MIT Technology Review, who writes about this technology and probably uses it occasionally as well. But in passing, who doesn't? So we're going to have 4 fantastic different perspectives. And obviously, we're very interested in your insights and thoughts and questions. So we're going to make sure we get plenty of time in the next hour to get your question and your comments as well. Just by way of introduction, I used to be a journalist back in the day for 20 years, working at places like the BBC and Channel 4 News. And even in that time, Anna will recall, there were these big changes. Before even the internet, there were digital tools. I was one of the first people at the BBC to use digital editing on a documentary back in 1992. And then I was at the BBC when this weird thing called BBC Online was launched. And most of my colleagues were dismayed by this. Why are we wasting this money on this online thing? There's nobody on the internet. Why are we bothering? And then I remember at Channel 4 News when social media started to happen, and similar response basically from journalists, which is, what on earth is this Twitter thing? This Facebook thing is a waste of time as well. And we learned different. I came to the LSE in 2006 to found a journalism think tank called Polis. And it was a wonderful coincidence because, of course, since then, there's been so much change, partly technological, but I think it's really important to remember so many other changes, the business model and so on, and also just the role of journalism, that we went from being, these gatekeepers of information to just another thing on your phone. And the way that changed the culture of journalism. And I've been tracking that. I've been very fortunate to witness it around the world. I think it's really important that we keep this discussion beyond just the UK and beyond Europe and so on. And for the last 6 years, I've been running the LSE's Journalism and AI project, which is, I should say, is funded by, of course, Google. And it's a global project which seeks to find out what journalists are doing with artificial intelligence, but also what they're thinking about it, how it's changing the way they work. And we also provide a huge amount of kind of training. We do innovation programs. We've just launched something called the Innovation Challenge, where Google have given us $4 million to give away to newsrooms around the world to help them to implement AI related tools that could help with misinformation, with revenue enhancement, and also with novel ways to create what we now call content, to create journalism. And I was looking at the submissions we had about 500 originally submissions from around the world, from incredibly diverse journalists or organizations. And again, FT, well, Melissa's a great example of different ways of doing journalism, different news organizations. I think it's really important to remember that. We think of the big cheeses like The Guardian or the New York Times or the BBC, but journalism is so diverse, and the way that generative AI is playing into that is so diverse as well. And in a way, it's quite inspirational, but also very worrisome, because I don't know if anybody here actually works in the news industry. But if you do, your position is probably quite precarious, quite underpaid, and you're subject to all sorts of pressures. You're expected to work so hard, and of course, everybody hates you. But you're doing great work. So what we're going to try and look at today is practically what is happening with these people who are so relevant to the journalism world, what is happening with generative AI in particular, but also what they think it means. I'm not going to try and define it. For me, AI generally is very much an umbrella term for a whole series of technologies, and generative AI is a particular variant of that, particular development of that. And the way it expresses itself is very diverse. I think, do I have to do the thing where I ask everybody, have you all used ChatGPT? If you haven't, then I don't know why you're in the room. But one of the transformational aspects of this has been that everyone can use it. And I'll be really interested to see what other people think about that, whether this is a kind of democratic opportunity, or whether we're still in the same old frame where it's the technologists that run the show. So I'm going to start off by just asking the panel to talk to me a little bit about what Gen AI means in their, it's just their working lives. You want to start with you, please?
Sure. Thank you, Charles. So at the FT, you might be familiar with we've already put in place a lot of public policies and stances to say that FT journalism is produced by journalists, reported by journalists, written by journalists. So our editor, Lula Klopp, wrote sort of an open letter early on in the generative AI business. These are the standards that we think about as newsroom. But that doesn't mean there's not a bunch of different places where we're experimenting with different AI technologies in a whole bunch of different processes that are mostly internal. So I'm excited to be able to tell you about a couple of the things that we're working on today. But from where I sit in the newsroom, I'm on our visual investigations team. So I'm on a team that is working on longer form stories using data and computational methods to try to uncover things that we wouldn't otherwise be able to uncover. So I'm in the rare position where I actually have lots of time and space to think on these stories and work on a longer time frame generally than the breaking news, which means that for me, a lot of the stuff we're doing with AI is in the sort of experimental, where we're building a mix of in-house technology and evaluating a lot of partners, trying, particularly using models that we can customize with data sets that we've collected, or with sort of professional level data sets from satellite data or corporate data, or maybe a leak that we get from someone. And those sorts of sort of tuned, internally developed models are things that we use a lot for different types of story finding. And the two broader categories we can talk about more, and I can use some more examples later, but I think about sort of searching for things and counting things are two of the things that I think AI and investigative journalism has a lot of opportunities, because it lets us look through more places and find sort of details and numbers in a data set that is otherwise sort of too big to really parse through in a reasonable human time span. And so I think I'll leave it there just to sort of give that as a teaser introduction. But
what about the actual,
what we got months of what do you do next? We're
getting leakage from the other
panel.
Send them to me pocket. But these used to really like.
Excellent. Okay. Just try and be a bit more specific on what the kind of tools when you say using AI, you talked about data sets and so on. What are the actual AI tools? And also, has the Gen AI developments in the last 2 years made a difference in terms of actual things that you're using?
Yeah. So I'll give two examples then of searching and counting that we've used different forms of AI, and not always strictly generative AI. So in the counting example, we've been working a lot with a couple of academics who developed a really sophisticated algorithm for measuring damage using satellite images. And so we've been looking at Gaza, we've been looking at Lebanon, we've been looking at other places in the world where we can send reporters to the ground in order to measure how many buildings have been destroyed, where are they, where do we see damage, where do we see rubble? And that allows us to sort of count instances of things that you could have a huge team of people poring over satellite imagery to find by hand. But this lets us do it sort of on the scale of news, and within a week or so of things happening, as soon as a satellite passes over, we can start to say, we know how many buildings have been destroyed in Lebanon, or we can measure as a percentage of the infrastructure in Gaza that's been destroyed. And so that's an example of sort of counting. Searching, we have worked with some models. So we used an off-the-shelf model from Amazon that was basically a facial recognition model. So this is not generative AI. This is what some people call discriminative AI, which is like trying to categorize and sort things. And we used that model to join two databases of images. One was a database of missing Ukrainian children that published by the Ukrainian government, basically a missing persons list. And then another was a database that a number of Russian state adoption services were listing kids who were up for adoption. And we were actually able to find children who were missing from Ukraine being put up for adoption in Russia. And these databases were tens of thousands of images that would have been way too long for us to compare one by one as reporters. But we could use a model to quickly go through these databases, say, here are the likely matches, and then take a much smaller subset for us to do further reporting on, and for us to then talk to families and try to get contact people using this sort of limited biographical details. And so that's an example of searching. And what's useful in the searching case especially is we're looking for cases where we can use AI in verifiable settings, where we can take the outputs of an AI model and then do traditional reporting and shoe leather reporting, and using other open source methods as well to confirm for certain the things that the AI thinks is probable. And so when you think about generative AI is sort of probabilistic in nature. It's thinking about predicting the next word. That's why you have hallucinations in ChatGPT. It's why there's a necessary level of uncertainty with any direct output of a generative AI model. So we're wary about using generative AI, especially in cases where it's going straight to the public. And instead, we think a lot about how do we use these internal tools in ways that we can double check the work. So a generative AI example is even consumer tool like ChatGPT. Google has a tool called Notebook LM that are good for summarizing and searching documents. So I can upload a 100-page PDF and then use the generative AI tool to more quickly find the 1 or 2 pages I'm interested in. You can think of it almost as a more advanced sort of Command F. And I think that there are useful cases for generative AI in those sorts of specific use cases, but we think a lot about verifiability when we use AI in the newsroom.
Which is good. That's good to hear. Rana, before we talk about the more global aspect, I'm just interested in that you are obviously working with the next generation of people who are going to be going into newsrooms, one hopes like the FT. What are you teaching them about AI in general, but generative AI in particular?
Yeah. So basically, I've been doing so much research in the past couple of years on the use of AI and adoption of generative AI in newsrooms. And the major problem I found is that many journalists were very scared of AI and resistant to, the adoption of this innovation and technology because of lack of knowledge and misconceptions. AI is going to take our jobs. AI is going to, replace us. We don't even understand what machine learning is, and it's already a big part of our industry. So I decided this semester to design a new module. It's called AI Enhanced News Reporting to teach to my students. So before they graduate, they already know, how to ethically and effectively use AI tools for example, fact checking, data verification, visual storytelling, how to use AI art generators, for example, for generating images, video graphics, infographics, to even create or, build a better and more compelling stories for their audience. I got like a lot of students, asking particularly about news personalization, what it means, and how it's going to change the future of journalism. So I talked to them a lot about, how AI systems, how AI models are being used right now to personalize and recommend, a certain type of content, news content to the audience, so we can engage them more, we can appeal to their appetite, since we are competing so hard for their attention. Also, I get, many questions about, all of that, ethical questions related to copyrights violations, data privacy violations, the very, increasing dominance and hegemony of tech companies over the journalism industry and all of this. And tackling all of these issues are super important in this module for my students to understand what they are facing and to actually understand the nature of the limitations of generative AI use in journalism. So once you understand that AI is not, perfect, it's not going to replace you. It has some limitations. It can be used for the, enhancing your work, and it's not going to replace you. Things get much better. I also, in this module, was keen to, introduce my students to programming and programming languages. So I give them a little bit about Python, how to use AI libraries in Python, and how to, analyze data sets for creating very interesting stories. So I don't want them to be professional programmers, but I just want them to understand that AI is not a vague thing that is gonna, steal jobs or whatever. It has, certain limitations. They can actually contribute to it, and they can actually benefit from it to a great extent in their daily news production routines.
And what's their kind of attitude? Because it always surprises me. I mean, in many ways of technological change, it's often been younger journalists who've been at the forefront. But your students are kind of elite journalism students. Do they embrace this? Are they enthusiastic, or did they see it actually as a threat to that lovely idealistic journalism they thought they were going to do as TV presenters and foreign correspondents in safari suits and so on? I mean, how enthusiastic are they about it?
Honestly, year one students are always struggling with the same narrative. Their parents, their friends were against them, doing a journalism course. Right. They're saying like journalism has no future. The TV is, going down, and no one is gonna, watch news online, and it's not like the most important career right now. And it takes, some time to talk to them through the process. I always tell them, instead of thinking that, technology is gonna, replace you, your job, and I totally believe this, your jobs and journalism jobs are more important than ever right now. Journalists in the, age of AI and in the post-truth era where we are right now, with a lot of fake news, misinformation, deep fakes, everything's going crazy all around the globe. Journalists are the only truth tellers on the ground right now. They are the only people who are paid to verify data, fact check information, and make sure that they are giving their audience the right and truthful information to the best of their, knowledge. So they always come with this very, passive, negative, attitude towards journalism. And it takes us, so long to show them the reality and the importance of their work, giving them examples from around the globe and how journalists are, more important than ever right now.
Cool. Melissa, I come to you. We'll talk perhaps a bit more about some of the kind of downsides, but you obviously observe this from the standpoint of a news organization that is deeply embedded in technology. How significant do you think, when you're looking at the way that journalists are using these technologies, how significant is it? I mean, has it been exaggerated, or do you see both good and bad use cases that are making a difference around AI?
Both. This is a boring answer, but let me elaborate. when I heard your investigation with facial recognition, that's a great example of how journalists and newsrooms can use these technologies. But I think, you have a very thoughtful approach of like humans first, right? And being very knowledgeable of where the risks lie, hallucination and, limitation of facial recognition, generative. And that's great. But I feel like in our industry, we have this pressure, this massive FOMO that we need to do something with AI because we were left behind by social media. We were left behind by the internet in a way. And, our business model is suffering because of that. And we don't want that as an industry to happen again. And so I feel like there's a lot of effort to, like, people are really trying to make this work. People are training their backlog on training models based on their archives, and those experiments aren't going very well as far as I know. And using things for summarization and just like really trying to innovate. So there's a lot of innovation, experimentation, and some projects work, and some don't. But I think we should definitely have the courage to call it. What do we see? It doesn't work.
Yeah. I mean, I was speaking to a German regional commission the other day, and they would do precisely what you were saying. They would try out all sorts of different tools. Some will work, some. One thing that they said worked emphatically was horoscopes. Because they're bullshit in the first place, so you can't get it wrong. There's no truth. Apologies. So do you think, where's your hypometer on this one? Do you think this is significant, or, compared to, you mentioned social media, just transformation?
I mean, it is, yes, of course. But there's a lot of hype, and like too much hype, frankly. And we're still in it. So anyone who can predict the future will be lying to you.
Yeah.
So I still want to do that.
Yeah.
But I think we're seeing early cases where it is useful. And, in my work, even though we're a small advisory, we don't have massive resources to do this. Even though we report on the cutting edge of technology, I use it, like we all use it, whether we want to or not, Google, that's all AI overviews.
Yeah.
You can't avoid that. And that's changing the way we consume information online. One of the most useful AI tools I use every day is Otter. I don't know if you're familiar with it. This is transcription software. I love it. It's my favorite tool. But there again, it's not perfect. The transcription comes up with sometimes hilarious mistakes. But, I know how to use it and to make it work for me.
Yeah.
So that's considerable scale.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. So I talk to journalists and they say, oh, no, I wouldn't ever use it. And then they say, well, of course, I do some transcription and I do translation. So, well, that's AI. Alan, turning to you, a bit more of a kind of wider perspective on this. When you hear people like this talking about the impact of these AI technologies and so on, where do you place it in? You went through going online, famously at The Guardian. You went through the whole rigmarole of social media and so on, and what that did to your business model as well as your journalistic practice and so on, and your relationship with the audience. I remember doing that Guardian weekend when you met the audience, which you hadn't done before, which I thought was fascinating. Where do you place what's going on at the moment in that kind of?
Well, three things. I mean, one, anything that makes journalism better is, of course, to be welcome. I think Peter's examples are fantastic. And when we were, amongst the first wave of news organizations that had these huge data sets, when we were working with WikiLeaks, Panama Papers, the Snowden documents, you suddenly had a newsroom confronted with a million documents, and we had to build search tools, very rudimentary search tools, to try and get inside these huge data sets. So that seems to me a really no-brainer and inspiring example of the way you can make journalism better. That sort of dovetails into the issue of cost, because there are two great issues in journalism. One is cost and one is trust. And there's obviously a fear that certain companies, I won't name them, will use this as a cost-cutting measure and a way of cutting corners. and I think that is quite dangerous because the people who make those kinds of decisions in newsrooms are quite often not journalists. So, the most basic example, the first unit any accountant will cut will be the investigative journalist unit, because that's really expensive and dangerous and legally fraught. And so that's obviously the first to go. But if you do that, you're destroying the very reason to read or sample the product in the first place. So my worry is that people will see the efficiencies that can be gained by using some of these tools at the expense of journalists, and will just make the product worse. And that bleeds into the issue of trust, which is probably the biggest thing facing not only journalists, but I think society at large, that people just don't know who to believe any longer. You've got that wonderful Steve Bannon phrase about flooding the zone with shit, and you can see that operating now that we're floating in the stuff. We're living in a world of complete information chaos, and people don't know who to trust. And you would think that they would trust journalists, but on almost any scale, including all the work that the Reuters Institute does, shows that the public are not trusting journalists, particularly in this country, but not only in this country. And journalists are very incurious, it seems to me, about the reason that they're not trusted. And I think there are lots of reasons to fear that if you're an average user of news and looking for people who you can trust, if you suspect that actually that the stuff you're looking at has been generated by machines, and if the news organizations are not transparent about that, that's another reason not to trust journalists. And just one thing with my oversight board hat on, it's interesting looking at a company like Meta, which is one of the biggest, if not the biggest and most sophisticated technology companies in the world. And I think, to be fair to it, it thinks more deeply than some other tech companies, Twitter, X, about the ethical dimensions, and takes these things seriously. But in the cases that we're getting at the Oversight Board, very interesting one involving Joe Biden, that video where it was edited to look as though he was inappropriately touching his grown-up granddaughter's chest. The degree to which even a giant company like Meta had not really got the processes or policies in place to think about things like that. I mean, a very basic thing, they have policies to do with altered video. They don't have policies to do with altered audio. And I think sometimes it takes that kind of sort of independent scrutiny from outside to point at even the biggest and the best companies are failing to get the balance right. And it seems to be a race between the people who are out to deceive and the people who are out to detect. And the detectors, I think, are not catching up with the deceivers yet.
How should they? What would you like to see happen? Perhaps within newsrooms, but also, you are still within newsrooms, but what should leadership be doing in relation? For example, your company, the FT, is doing deals with tech companies. What do you think should be the strategy of news organizations regarding technology? And more broadly, what else can be done to remove or reduce the...
Well, I agree with everything that's been said so far about the need to be in the space and to experiment deep. And I think what Peter began by saying, which is the sort of mission statement from the FT, saying everything you read has been produced by or verified by or edited by humans. I think this sounds like a trite thing to say, but transparency around all this is nearly always the best policy. The big tech companies are not always great at being transparent. But I just think it's a great policy for news organizations generally to be completely open about what it is they do and to have discussions in the open about the most fundamental aspects of what journalism is. And we've already heard that just journalism now it's such a sort of weak word, journalism, to describe multiple activities. So the Daily Mail is journalism, the Sun is journalism, the New York Times is journalism, the BBC is journalism, lots of stuff on Substack is journalism. It's a very sort of weak word to describe multiple completely different ideas of a craft. And I think the more that we can be open and start discussing that, the more people might be inclined to be more discriminating about where they want to place their trust. And I think it's right for people to be extremely mistrustful about most information.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point about what we mean when we talk about journalism. You know, the Reuters survey is wonderful, but when you ask people, do you trust journalism? What do we mean by the journalism? You know, Peter, coming back to you, I know I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of the FT, but from your own sort of personal perspective, thinking going forward, I mean, when I think of your job title, it wouldn't have existed a few years ago. You know, the data thing and the visual thing. I mean, you work at the FT, for God's sake. You should be writing. It should be numbers and words and things. Where do you see this going forward? I mean, partly in terms of scale, how revolutionary is this, or is it incremental? But when you think about, I mean, Rana mentioned careers, you know, where do you see your career going in terms of these technologies?
Yeah, it's a hard question. I wish I had the answer. If you figure out.
No, exactly. Well, prediction is pointless, as Melissa says. But...
Exactly. Yeah, as Melissa said. I think I see a world where almost every reporter is using AI tools in their day-to-day.
Yeah.
I mean, as you mentioned also, they already are, right? If they're using Google, if they're using Google Translate is like revolutionary for reporting, right? I mean, I cover regions and languages that I don't speak.
Yeah.
Thanks to Google Translate, right? And
10 years ago, that was an impossible, really hard problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think like we forget the pace of change in some ways, and like things get normalized really quickly, right? But like when I think of the FT, like the bread and butter of the FT is corporate reporting, right? Is covering markets, is covering companies, is covering what's happening in them. And I think that reporters who are covering a beat, one part of the job is relational, right? Is meeting people, understanding people, talking to people. And I don't think that's going away.
Right.
Like I actually think that in many ways, reporters are some of the more protected roles from AI, at least in the type of reporter who's trying to find out brand new things, because so much of that job is building trust with people and talking with them and building relationships across the industry or a company that you're covering. And so I think that the part where reporters are going to be using AI is often on the research and the data side of things, right? Like lots of reporters at the FT who cover a company will use tools like a Bloomberg terminal or like a Dow Jones data sets, right? To sort of know what's happening in all the companies that beats. And there's no reason that AI can't help summarize press releases faster for you or help ping you with the piece of market data that's most important for you and your beat today. So I think there's a world where we could have a lot of sort of AI augmented journalism, like tools for journalists to help them cover their patch more effectively. But I have a hard time imagining a world where a lot of the sort of softer relational parts get automated away.
And arguably, in a world where so much journalism content information can be generated semi-automatically or automatically, surely the human bit's going to become more important. You know, whether it's your personality or your knowledge or your passion about a topic is going to become more important. Melissa, I know you do, obviously you report on positive aspects, you know, breakthroughs and so on, but thinking about in terms of AI and this technology is in terms of the journalism, what are the kind of mistakes that you see and how much is it about the technology or the limits of the technology itself, or is it about misuse by journalists of the technology? And Alan was saying, obviously, bad people will use this.
When I started covering AI for 5 years, and in that time, that story has really changed. For the first 3, no one cared.
That's right.
It was like nation nerdy and whatever. about developers and about nuclear physics. And the past 2 years, it's suddenly in the front page of the New York Times. And this, we've seen a massive cohort of AI beat journalists writing about AI and covering it. And the fact is, AI is a really complicated beat to cover. Like there's so much nuance of levels and hype and lobbying. And those, I think, one of the things that concerned me in the beginning is like people aren't getting the story and they're falling into the traps set by the tech sector. And, that in turn contributes to the immense hype cycle we're seeing right now. And so getting the story wrong and just not like understanding how the technology works and like falling into the traps like, AI can predict crime, like it cannot predict the future. Things like that. That is definitely one. And another one is like, obviously, social media and the internet's full of AI generated stuff. We have to be really, really careful about falling into those traps, like reporting on stuff that is fake. But that, I think that's an old problem that is heightened with the AI age. And I think that is increasing what we're seeing. Like, we're not seeing necessarily new problems, but like all problems just being like on steroids thanks to AI. I haven't seen that much like actual journalists using technology. I mean, of course, you have the bad actors who are using it to create fake news, but I don't necessarily use it.
Yeah. What do you think about the sort of, you said driven by the tech sector, people like Les Hinton and so on, and Sam Altman talking about, the sort of existential crisis that AI might bring. And the sort of front page stories about we're all going to die because of the robots. What kind of impact do you think that's had on the way we talk about AI?
Well, there's no evidence to suggest that it's possible. But if you think about it, that these technology companies are building technology that could kill us all, that makes it sound really powerful and really potent, right? Suddenly you're like, oh, we should take it seriously. This is not just a model that can predict the next war, but it's something that can actually kill our planet. So that also adds to the kind of mental image of this technology being way more powerful than it is currently. Who knows? I mean, I think it's a matter of almost like belief, whether you believe this technology can ever reach that state or not. There are different schools of thought within the AI community, and they don't agree. They all hate each other. So yeah, let's see where the research goes. But I think that narrative has been extremely powerful for like our understanding of where the real risks of AI lie and where we're investing our efforts.
Yeah, exactly. Rana, one of the things that fascinates me, my project works very, very globally. I'm intrigued, and I don't know the answer to this, perhaps you do, but in a way it seems to me that unlike previous technologies, this is actually very accessible for people in countries which don't have the same technology resources or general resources. I'm thinking, the so-called global south. What's your sense of how this will play out in newsrooms which don't necessarily have the resources of places like the FT?
Honestly, I think it's a double-edged weapon. It's not, necessarily something good. If we take, for example, the latest 2024 Indian elections as an example, the widespread of AI-powered manipulation and political propaganda, the widespread of, fake news, deep fakes, voice cloning, micro-targeting using generative AI tools is massive. And, it left journalists with so much burden. They still have access to AI tools, and they still have access to AI tools that can help them in fact-checking, but it's not easy at all because this was, much bigger than them. I talked to many Indian journalists for my one of my latest research projects, and they felt like it's beyond us. We spent like so many hours every day, verifying those deepfakes and voice clones that don't only or are not only circulated by the public, but also by verified accounts of top politicians, political parties, very famous celebrities from Bollywood who amplified all of these, fake propaganda and influenced, voters in different ways. And because it was too much for journalists to do something like that, they came, together with a project funded by Google News Initiative called Shakti. So they, allocated different resources, human resources and financial resources to fact check and to verify information. But it was a hell of elections for them. It was like very hard time for them. So access is not necessarily something good, because also many of all of these generative AI tools created in the Western world don't have native support for non-Western languages. So when you use them in Arabic, they create a lot of, inaccurate information, inaccurate language, inaccurate, problems. In ChatGPT is not an exception to that. So accessibility doesn't always mean that people have already, power, or they are empowered to use it in a better way. And unfortunately, from what I found in Arab newsrooms, for example, from my research, I found out that the lack of data transparency in authoritarian countries and the lack of data access, especially to public records, is a major problem against local innovation. Because even if you have tech developers in those countries and they want to use large data to train AI models specific to the language and to the needs of these countries, it's so hard because governments have control over all of that, and they don't allow anyone to access this information. So it's a major problem, honestly, in the global south, and they are still really struggling even with available AI tools, because they are sometimes weaponized by governments, by state actors, by some malicious actors, many of them, against the people and the public good.
Yeah. So yeah, it'd be really hard for you, Peter, to do your data journalism if you don't have the data. That's right. Listen, I've realized time's flown past, and I did say we'd take questions. So do anybody have loads? That's great. Okay. We've got a microphone. We're about to have a microphone, and I'm going to start there. So you've made me. Yeah, that's right.
Thank you, and really compelling to hear these stories, particularly the one about Ukraine and Russia. That really strikes our souls. I'm really interested in also how you're going to market your news companies using generative AI. And I've seen, for example, I think The Economist is really an interesting case history where it's always been a wonderful, I don't know whether you call it a magazine or a journal, but you really couldn't have the time to read it. You would carry it everywhere, but by the end of the week, oh my God, you were still on page one. Now I get woken up by it. I've been on their writing course, which is absolutely wonderful, where you're talking to the children directly on how to write a good sentence. It's in every night. It's there in the morning when I wake up. It's there in the evening. It's probably pinging me now. Incredible digital turnaround of something that seemed quite staid, and now also being adopted by all the young generation. Lots of my students are now reading it because they need, even if they're in fashion, to get into geopolitics, right? We all have to understand geopolitics more than we had to. How do you see today this how do you capture, and are you going to use Gen AI in marketing of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I always think The Economist is fascinating. Martin Bress from The Economist told me once that their biggest problem was that people stopped subscribing because the magazines would pile up on their coffee table at home, and they felt this guilt. They hadn't read them all the time. This is obvious one for you, Alan. If you were, still at the helm, say, of The Guardian, so you still at the helm of journalism, what is your approach? Do you sort of celebrate this and say, hey, look, we've got all this fantastic, shiny new ways of doing things, and go for that? Or does that?
Well, I think you have to. I mean, in the early days of the internet and what used to be called the second WW2, the Second World Wide Web, the news publishers had this big choice about whether you went where the audience was or whether you tried to get the audience onto your platform, and we tried to do the former. And I remember when The Economist was first on Snapchat, and you thought, The Economist, Snapchat, they're completely different ideas of what journalism is, until I looked at The Economist on Snapchat, and I thought, this is pretty good, actually. because I don't always religiously read The Economist, and I thought this is a good way of sampling the Economist. And it's a challenge. We've had it on. I mean, Prospect is all about very long pieces, delving into the context and nuance and subtlety that other news organizations may not always have. And I tried it in the newsroom the other day because I read something about, I think it was Aftonbladet in Sweden was doing summaries of stories. And if you put the sort of 3 bullet points of a story at the top, people were more likely to then read the long story. And I did that with a long and complicated Prospect article and took it out to my client. I can't remember which, it was probably ChatGPT to just summarize it in 3 bullet points. Took it out to my colleagues and said, I've just done this summary. What do you think? Should we do this more? And they thought that was pretty good. And I said, okay, well, the bad news for your jobs is that was done in 0.5 of a second by, and it was really good. And we haven't yet adopted it, but I think we should, because if that's a way into a 4,000 word block of text, and is going to make that 4,000 word block of text seem less intimidating. And if you've gone through the summary and agree that it's a good summary and you might tweak it, why wouldn't you do that?
Exactly. Let's take another question. Right at the front, please. Right at the front, please. Sorry.
Good morning. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the notion of having an AI avatar delivering the news that may or may not be mostly contributed to or written entirely by humans, and what impact that might have on the audience, the perception of trust, and the relationship sort of behind the scenes, and how that story might be developed or delivered.
Let's take a couple more, actually. So avatars, then one here, then one there.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, so even just taking AI out of the equation, there's kind of so much nonsense out there that people believe. You have presidential candidates saying that immigrants are eating people's pets, and the left-leaning press will kind of say this probably isn't true, and the right-leaning press, or at least the Trump-leaning press, will maybe just repost it without comment. One of the really powerful things that I've found about things like Claude is that if it tells me something that I don't believe or understand, I can actually just ask, what do you mean by this? And given if you read a news story that you're already predisposed to not believing, if there's something in there you don't understand, you're kind of quite likely to just bin that thing and say, oh, they're just talking nonsense. Do you think that there's any future in AI helping people understand why what you're telling them is the truth compared to what someone else is telling them?
Building on the avatar question there, actually, something that we haven't gotten into was, what if there's a completely new type of media company that starts? It's definitely probably going to be less costly. It might be releasing news in a much faster fashion, competing with these much traditional journalism and media companies. I would love to get your take on that and how we would also be thinking about these traditional media companies partnering with these potential new types of companies that might come out.
Pete from business. See, Google, sir. Listen.
Us too. Oh, thank you. To your question of trust, I can't remember where for the life of me, but there was a new paper, I think we wrote about it, where an AI system was used to convert people's ideas or, change their minds. So because an AI can obviously have so much more data and information than a human can ever. So if you chat with an AI chatbot, it was able to change people who believed in conspiracies to believe in facts. And that's great. I think we should be really thinking about that in our field. And to your question on AI avatars, I wrote a story on Synthesia. Maybe you are familiar with it, but it's a UK-based startup that does hyper-realistic AI avatars. And I made one of myself. And it was creepy because it was so good. You would not know it was not me. And I think AI avatars in news, one thing, we are really used to seeing other people's faces. So when it's off, that throws us, and that adds an element of mistrust. But if these avatars get really good, maybe that becomes a compelling way to share information. But then obviously you have to have it, a human has to have made the journalism, whatever. If it's just for like presentation and sharing on social media, I don't see a problem necessarily. But I would love to hear what others.
On the avatar thing, I talked to this producer in New York about whether they would ever use avatars. And he said, somewhat cynically, he said, look, when we have a radio bulletin, the newscaster walks in, reads my script, walks out again. It may as well be a robot. Apologies to any presenters out there. Peter, feel free, any of those questions?
Yeah, I'll just very briefly add on the avatars question, which I think is an interesting one. And I think readers still connect with people. Like a trend you'll see in a lot of newsrooms, actually, like if you look at the New York Times homepage these days, there's almost always a little vertical video of one of the reporters talking straight to camera about the work that they've done. And we at the FT have started doing similar videos that we publish on TikTok accounts and Instagram accounts. And people connect knowing that someone has done the work. And we focus a lot also on how do we show our work along the way and how do we take readers through the months of reporting that might have led up into a story. And I think that that's hard to capture with an avatar. It's not a real person. On the flip side, like I think there are interesting use cases for like podcasts and videos and things. I mean, at the FT, all of our podcasts are sort of human hosted, and we think that the personality of the hosts are really important. But I can imagine a world, and I think some news organizations are already doing this, where if you need to correct a little fact or fix a little edit or something in a podcast, I mean, Alan, you have a podcast, like going back and overdubbing and like fixing things in a podcast takes a long time. And I can imagine a world when we're already there where you could easily fix a word here or a sentence there in a podcast and save yourself the time of having to go back through it all.
Alan, can I get you to talk about this last question, this idea that could you create a sort of completely synthetic media source, outlet, organization? Partly because I remember, many decades ago now, I wrote a book about the future of journalism, and I was very excited by the new technologies and so on. One thing I completely missed was the idea of the institution, the idea of what a news organization does beyond just producing it. And you spoke very eloquently about that in terms of the pressure you came under with Snowden and WikiLeaks and so on, the intelligence people coming around and smashing up your hard drives and so on. So what is it? Can we have a completely synthetic media institution, do you think?
You're right about the value of the institution, and you're right that when The Guardian came under the most severe pressure from states and intelligence services, and to be frank, other media organizations, when we were doing all the phone hacking stuff and we were under attack by Murdoch, having the institutional weight to stand behind the reporter is incredibly important. But that's not quite what you're asking, is it? So, I think it's a really, especially in the context of local journalism, which is the first to die, and how could you recreate the function of local journalism, the sort that I'm sure Charlie and I grew up doing, of being present in spending bodies and local government bodies, the police, the ambulance service, the education service, and so on and so forth. I can see a way in which that probably is already being done to some extent and could be done, and it's better than nothing. So if you had a very slenderly resourced newsroom that could find a way, as Peter's describing, of going through all those minutes of all these organizations and extracting the information, why not? Why? It's better than nobody doing it, and I'm sure that the tools will get better. But in the end, again, it comes down to this question of whether, because journalism is meaningless unless people do trust it. I was going to make a joke about avatars and newsreaders, and what we want is newsreaders like Hugh Edwards we can really trust. But I won't go there. Don't. Please, Rana.
I just want to add to something related to trust. Actually, although people don't, trust journalism, unfortunately, in many parts of the world, they still trust it more than news robots and AI generated, news content. So luckily, compared to AI, we're still more trusted, and people want, to get stories from human beings who put like some effort, some investigation into it. So basically, although many newsrooms love to, market themselves as, smart tech, early adopters of smart tech and all of this, they still, love to present, how strong they still have like credible journalists who can offer something for people, and from people. So I think although AI has, a great potential in this, we will always, look at human journalists very high. They'll always be very important for, the public when it gets to trust. What we can do to make people trust us more actually is to give them what they want and to, give them information that they can really, rely on. This mission is becoming so much harder for journalists right now, everywhere in the world, with all of the political, pressure and all of the widespread of mis and disinformation. So that's our job, and I think it's very important job right now for people to trust us more.
Okay, we've only got about 4 minutes left, so I'm going to has anybody got absolutely blindingly brilliant questions?
Yes, that is incredibly short. Please, in the middle there.
With such an august panel and audience, I can't live up to the claim that I've just made, but here's a thought. Trust is something that I think has been lost in public discourse. As journalists, you can report accurately on what you see. I wonder if you could comment on the fact that what you see is no longer trustable. And therefore, as a journalist and as someone representing a brand of journalism, where you could theoretically say, this is correct, we have checked our facts, and we've reported it accurately, what do you think is the role of journalism in finding the truth?
So when I look at how do we know that this isn't all a simulation? Your final thought on, on that? You start.
Sure. I'll just very quickly say that, like, my job on the visual investigations team, we use a lot of computational methods. I could not do my job without the network of reporters the FT has around the world in these places, right? Like, I spent the last couple of weeks looking at measuring damage in Lebanon, and without those colleagues in Beirut who can actually be on the ground and say, no, I saw this apartment building collapse, or talk to people who were in different villages across the country, we rely on as many different methods of identifying that truth as we can. And so, having that range of different ways of knowing is, I think, one of the values that journalism can bring.
And just to add to that, I would really like to see more efforts from companies, working on watermarking or metadata, or like any kind of technical ways we can have like a layer of fact checking. Those efforts are in their early days, and I'm really happy to see them, but we need more, and we need them now.
I agree with Melissa. Actually, we need, some support. Yesterday, a lot of people were talking about, how important it is for, tech companies, in the public, and journalists, in the governments, and everyone, different stakeholders, to come together to support, transparency and truth telling and all of this. But I think, if we get that type of support from tech companies, if they are like always very transparent about what data they are, using to train their AI models and create all of these generative AI tools, it's gonna help us so much, to identify the quality and the degree of quality of all of these AI, tools, and how to use them effectively. And I think we live in the simulation already, so I totally believe that. So.
There's a really interesting question about truth. I always was frightened of the word truth as a journalist. I thought that was too big a thing to ask of journalists. But I think be more modest and go for facts. And even facts now are becoming hard to pin down. But that should be the primary thing that journalists can do to a society, is to get society to coagulate around agreed facts. But I mean, look at the debate around COVID and the unwillingness of journalism to treat the issue of climate change as something about which there are facts, but to treat it as an ideological issue, and on which side you're on. So but I think, at the minimum, journalism ought to just think about creating a fact-based society. My one overall arching take from this is, as a feeling of sad, the fracture that has happened between the big tech companies and journalism. Because there was a time when they were both searching for the answers to these issues. And the big tech companies are so prodigious. I mean, if you think how brilliant they are, if there's a sort of 5 seconds of a Taylor Swift song where it shouldn't be, there's brilliant at clamping down on copyright issues within seconds. And they're going to get really good at some of the issues we've talked about today. But at the moment, big tech has really given up on journalism, and journalism views big tech as the enemy. And I wish there was a way that these companies could get together and heal that rift, because I think we need each other.
Great. Listen, I know for a fact this event did happen, and it was, I personally really enjoyed it and learnt a lot. And thank you for some brilliant questions as well. So thank you very much to my panelists.